Hello, welcome, and thank you for attending this training. Today's session will have 5 sections. First, we will talk about open science and research data management, then about funding agency requirements. We will continue describing what the research data and its publication, and finally, we'll talk about RDR, the Research Data Repository. Let's start with open science and research data management. The first question is, what is open science? International institutions such as UNESCO and the European Commission assume that the research will be instrumental to find solutions to environmental, social and economic challenges that our planet is facing. The research must be developed in an open environment, that is, in an ecosystem that facilitates that the research results are transparent, accessible, interoperable, and reusable, and that science is made with and for society. This new way of doing science is called open science, and it is nothing more than science done right. And from CSUC, what do we offer to facilitate open science? In addition to incentivizing open science here in Catalonia, CSUC offers different services related to open science. Open access is promoted through policy proposals. We coordinate Research Portal of Catalonia, a website that aims to visualize and disseminate the research activity carried out in Catalonia from a centralized location. We also make available different repositories for publications, such as TEDx for theses, RACO for journals, or ResearCat for scientific articles. And finally, what brings us together here today? Research data management services are offered through EINA DMAP and the Research Data Repository. On the slide, we can see different types of data in different formats: photograph, tabular files, collection of interviews, among others. But what do they have in common? It's all research data. But what do we mean by data? Data is an information that has been collected, observed, generated, or created to validate original research findings. An open research data is data that is online, free of cost, accessible, and can be reused and redistributed as long as the source is cited. And what do we mean by dataset? A dataset is a set of files which can be data, code, documentation, and the metadata that describe them. These files are grouped as a dataset for a reason, and sometimes the reason might be that they are part of the same project, or they may give veracity and validate the results of an article. Open data is an important element of making data reusable, but it is not the only one, and sometimes it's not possible or appropriate to publish data openly. The community has created the FAIR principles to define how to make research data as reusable as possible. FAIR is an acronym to findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. For each of these concepts, there is a basic set of principles to optimize the reuse of data. For example, for data to be findable, that is F, they must be assigned a unique identifier such as DOI. In order for them to be accessible, they must be available using open and free protocols. To be interoperable, they must follow the conventions and rules of the discipline, and they must be able to export automatically between different portals. Finally, for them to be reusable, they must have rich metadata and a clearly defined license. Well, research data management, or also known by its acronym in English RDM, is the set of practices related to the creation of data, the organization or structure of this data, the storage, preservation, or sharing of data for reuse. There are different types of data. For example, observational data are those that are captured in real time. Experimental data in a laboratory equipment. Simulation data are generated from models. Derivative or compilations are reproducible but difficult to reproduce. and reference data is a conglomerate of data. And regardless of the type, all of them usually go through different stages. At first, raw data are those that have not been analyzed or processed. Then, when they are processed and analyzed, they are curated data, which can be done by the researcher himself or receive help from the institution support service. From that moment on, some data will be published, and in parallel, metadata are those data that accompany the data and describe the resource. Now that we know what research data, datasets, and the FAIR concept are, let's talk about funding agencies and the requirements. At European level, the European Commission is the great leader of this new paradigm shift in open science. From its predecessor programs to the current Horizon Europe, it has been gradually asking for research data management to be embedded in research projects. At the state level, we have the Law of Science and the Organic Law of the University System that also advocate for the same principles. Even more recently, at the Catalan level, we have the Law of Science and the Catalan Open Science Strategy, also follow the same principles. But specifically, what is generally asked for in relation to data? Well, there are two requests. First, to make a data management plan and update it periodically, and then to deposit the data in a trusted repository. There is a repository that has minimum guarantees of quality, long-term preservation, and so on, following the FAIR principles because, as we have already said, it does not necessarily mean that the data must be open, but that they must be as open as possible and as close as necessary. That said, now let's have a look at some of the aspects to consider when choosing a repository. Therefore, we will now deal with research data and its publication. Before talking about how to choose a trusted data repository, we will see what the research process is like and at what point should we make this deposit and publication of research data. The research process begins with planning. At this point, we prepare the DMP. Then we present the DMP to the funding agency, and once it's accepted, we can start researching and analyzing and managing the data. At that time, the DMP should be modified if the initial approach to research is also modified. Once we have the research datasets that can be published, we can deposit them in a trusted repository that will allow the data to be discovered by others from different portals. Well, now let's focus on where to publish. When it comes to publishing, choosing one path or another has different implications. Of the following options, if we choose to include the data as supplementary material in a journal, in most cases we will be assigning the data rights to the publisher. Consequently, we will be replicating the business model of the current journals. If we choose posting the datasets on the personal project website, we usually find that the project ends and we stop making all this information public because we can no longer afford to pay the domain or similar one. If we opt for a generalist repository, we must assess the viability of the project, and most importantly, we need to be aware that these repositories do not have current and quality control processes. That's why the two most advisable ways are always to bet on the institutional repository or a consolidated disciplinary one. So what should we consider? First, whether or not a consolidated disciplinary repository exists. In the disciplinary field, everyone or almost everyone knows whether these repositories exist. If not, we will show you where to find them later on. Second, there are more things we need to consider if the needs of my data meet the requirements of the repository, either by the size of the dataset or the format, or if it allows me or not to publish the data openly or restricted, for example. Indeed, does the repository assign a persistent identifier? And is it specifically a DOI? Is it certified as a trusted repository? It is good that we ask ourselves all these questions before deciding where to put our data. Here you have a good resource for searching for data repositories. Wikidata is a directory that allows us to search and select disciplinary and multidisciplinary repositories. Wikidata contains more than 3,000 searchable repositories by name or by discipline. In addition, filters can also be added to narrow down the search. Some of the filters are certification, license, PIT, subjects, language of the repository, or type of the institution, to mention a few. Apart from this resource, there are many others such as fairsharing.org, OpenDoar, or Recollecta, to highlight some of them. Last but not least, we finish the session talking about the Research Data Repository, which allow us to publish FAIR data. The Research Data Repository, or RDR, is a federated repository for datasets. That is, each participating institution has its own space to publish the datasets of its research community. It's used by both universities and circle research centers. It's multidisciplinary and designed for use by both research staff and doctoral students in the Catalan research system. The repository follows the FAIR principles, so depositing a dataset in RDR will help you comply with funder mandates. The RDR, as we have already said, allows compliance with the requirements of the financing agencies and stores the data on servers in Catalonia. You can deposit as many datasets as you want, since there is no limit. In terms of data curation, each institution has a data curator, who will help you make the data you deposit as fair as possible. In addition, CSUC also has a specialized personnel in data curation and who give advice to participating institutions. However, if you have any question regarding your data, you should always contact your institution's support service first, as they are the ones who will be able to help you most. Now let's talk about the rights of the datasets. In other repositories, the rights of the datasets belong to the company or institution behind the repository. With the RDR, the rights of publication, custody, and dissemination will be yours or of your institution, depending on what is established by each institution. Some more features to note about RDR is data sharing. The data you deposit may be shared with others before it's published. This can be done by generating a private URL or giving permissions to other users so that they can access the unpublished dataset. In addition, the RDR will allow you to add the ORCID of the researchers who are part of the dataset, which will make it more findable. Speaking of visibility, RDR is at EOSC, OpenAIRE, Recollecta, and Google. RDR allows you to update the dataset despite being published and to make as many versions as necessary. Regarding the file formats that make up the dataset, RDR transforms some of the proprietary formats that are deposited and offers an open version, in addition to the original version proprietary format. In the datasets deposited in the RDR, related publications can be linked through metadata in addition to choosing the license we want the dataset to have. In terms of preservation, the RDR ensures that the datasets remain available for a minimum of 10 years. Once we have seen the characteristics of RDR, let's look at how the repository is organized to understand how it works in general. On the screen, you can see the logos of the institutions that are currently part of repository. Each participating institution has a space where to deposit its datasets and create subspaces for research groups or projects, departments, etc. We call this space that each institution has for the datasets instance or community. And how can we register in the data repository? Well, there are two ways depending on our institution. If our institution has Unificat, we can create a user simply by using our institutional credentials. We just have to go to login, search for our institution in the drop-down menu and select it. We will automatically be redirected to the institutional portal where we will have to put the credentials. And what happens if our institution does not have Unificat? In that case, we can register through the option Sign up for a Dataverse account that is located in the Login section, where we will have to enter some registration data. Then, to access the account, we must go to the Login and select the option Other Options User Email. Alright, now we know how to access the repository, and then we will talk about how to make the dataset deposit. If you identify yourself with Unificat, you can automatically deposit in your institution's space. If registration and identification is not through Unificat, you may need to contact your institution for permission to make the deposit. You will know if you have deposit permissions if you go to your institution and find the button on the Add Data screen, and expanding it, the new dataset appears. Let's start making the deposit. When we click on the Add Dataset button, a first page will appear with the essential metadata that we must fill in the dataset. First of all, a predefined information that indicates the space where the dataset, host database, is being deposited, and then if you are using a template that has predefined metadata, dataset template. If you want certain fields to be prefiled, so you don't have to fill them out each time you deposit a dataset, get in touch with your institutions to consider creating a template. In the essential metadata, we must add a descriptive title of the dataset. If the title matches the publication's title, we must precede the title with the replication data for. This option is set automatically by clicking the blue button you see on the screen. Then it's time to add the authors that are part of the dataset, whenever possible with their corresponding ORCID. To add more fields, just click on the blue button with the plus sign. Any metadata that has this button next to it indicates that it's a multi-value metadata. Additionally, contact information must be provided so that other researchers can reach you when consulting the dataset, along with the description of the dataset. This description should include information about the dataset's content, the formats available, the number of files, the variables the files present, and so on. It's important to note that the description should not contain the article's abstract, as it's not a summary of the research, but information about what is inside the dataset. We need to consider here what information is necessary for a researcher to decide whether or not they are interested in downloading the dataset. On the screen, you can see that there are some files that have a red asterisk. This red asterisk indicates that its metadata is part of mandatory minimum metadata agreed between the participating institutions of the RDR, and that, therefore, to continue with the deposit, it's mandatory to put this metadata. Some other metadata, which are not part of the essential ones, but are specific to certain disciplines, are those that you can see on the screen. There are also mandatory minimum metadata. If you go to Subject, you will find a drop-down menu where you need to choose the dataset's discipline. If there is no suitable discipline, you have the option Other. Then you will need to fill the related publication and the keywords, which preferably should use a controlled vocabulary. There is also a notes section where you can explain what cannot be described in other metadata fields. In addition, you have a metadata language where you can indicate the language of the dataset in a drop-down menu. The producer and distributor metadata are predefined but can be changed. The depositor metadata are used to give credit to the depositor. The deposit date is predefined and the data type must be selected from a drop-down menu and is multi-value. Once we have filled in the metadata, we will have to add the files that make up the dataset. These files are added through the section Select Files to Add. Each dataset must contain a README file in TXT that describes the content of the data and allows the reuse. Some of the data that should appear in the README are the meaning of variables, which units of measurement are used, and more. In the link in readme.txt, you will find the template that we offer you to create your dataset README file. We also want to tell you that for the dataset to have a certain file structure, it's necessary to upload the dataset to a zip with the structure we want it to have. To save the dataset, it's only necessary to click on Save Dataset. Once saved, the dataset will be in draft and therefore will not be public to everyone. Only you and relevant people who have permissions, such as your institution's data curator, will be able to see it. Now on the screen we can see what a draft dataset looks like. That is, it's not yet public to everyone. At the top we see informative messages that warn us that the dataset has been created, that it is a draft and that the tabular file is being ingested. The intake process is the one we have discussed, in which the repository offers an open version in some file types, in addition to the original closed version. We can also see the status of the dataset from the tags that are under the title. Where it says example title is where the title of the dataset goes. Below, we see the citation of the dataset with the corresponding DOI, which is assigned once we save the dataset. It's not necessary to wait to publish the dataset for the DOI to be assigned. Finally, at the bottom, we have several sections where can modify information related to the dataset. We have the file sections where we will add, delete, or change files. In addition, we may also restrict or embargo files. In the metadata section is where we can delete metadata or add new ones. The term section where we can establish the term of access and use of the dataset. And finally, the version sections where the changes that have been made to the dataset once it has been published will be seen. Returning to the metadata section, to edit it you have to click on Add plus Edit Metadata. In this section we will not only find the metadata that we have filled in previously and can modify, but we will also find other new metadata to fill in also metadata by discipline. Regarding the terms of use and conditions, you should know that by default the Creative Commons CC0 license is assigned, which is the most open license. To change it, it's necessary to do so through the Terms section. To edit the Terms section, simply go to Edit Term Requirements. Now let's talk about the deposit and publishing process. The first time you are going to make a deposit, you should contact your institution first. Once you have reached your institution, you can deposit the dataset, fill in the metadata, change the license of use, etc. All the process we have seen so far, and send it for review. You should know that once you have submitted the dataset for review, you will not be able to make any changes until the person in charge of your institution returns it to you. It's for this reason that we should only send the dataset for review when we are sure that it's already publishable. Therefore, to send the dataset for review, you must click on the section Submit for Review. On the screen, you can see the entire deposit and publication process. It starts with you by depositing the dataset and sending it for review. Your institution's data curation person will then review it, and if any changes need to be made, return it to you. You will receive a notification, and the process will start again, and you will need to submit it for review again. In the event that there are no changes, the curator will publish the dataset, and it will already be visible to everyone with the restrictions you have set for the files. That is, even if the dataset is public, if there are files that are restricted, they will not be public. You will be able to edit the dataset even if it's public, and this will generate a draft version of the dataset, which must be republished, and therefore you will have to resubmit it for review. Finishing with today's training, we will see why RDR allows us to publish in a fair way. The RDR allows the dataset to be findable, the F for findable, because it's assigned a DOI automatically upon deposit. Then there is accessibility, which allows us to access files and restrict them, leave them open or embargo them. We make the dataset interoperable through metadata and export to other schemes. And finally, we make it reusable by establishing the terms of use and licenses and showing the version history. And so far, today's session on how to publish research data with the Research Data Repository. If you have any questions, we recommend that you contact your institution so that they can support you in the development and use of RDR. Thank you.